So I'd like to begin this morning with sharing 3 different stories, and I hope they'll string together at the end. The first, I want to share with you one of my favorite places in the world, Stanley Park, the edge of downtown Vancouver, British Columbia. Anyone been there? Yeah. So it's this 5-mile radius peninsula set on the end of this downtown, jetting right out into the bay. And it's a preserved area. It's got this great bike path, footpath that goes around the outside of it, so you get to see lots of seals and eagles, and if you're really lucky, even an orca once in a while. And then the middle of it is this hilled area that is preserved and is covered in trees. It's this gorgeous forest. And the forest has lots of paths running through it. And I would love wandering through those paths, especially when I'd come along these big old red cedars. Massive. You could try to hug it, but you can't even get close to getting your arms around these trees. Well, these trees, many of them have fallen over time, and some of them because they were felled intentionally, and others when strong windstorms come by. But there was something beautiful. Is you'd have these trunks of old trees, and then growing out of the top of a tree would be a new tree. So this idea that out of death, there's new life coming forth. And in part, it's because that decaying old tree provides all of the vital nutrients that this new tree needs to survive. So I love walking through Stanley and seeing that, this symbol of hope, but also for this reminder of what it takes to be good soil. Another place that I would love to wander is at the foot of receding glaciers in New Zealand. I was there for a few years, and the ecology course that I was a part of, we would always go to a glacier bed to see firsthand the life cycle of a forest. So basically we would walk up to the edge of the glacier and then walk out towards the ocean, and basically we would get to see the life cycle, the most young, newest forest, and the oldest as the less time that it had been without a glacier there. So up at the edge of the forest, or at the edge of the glacier, it would just be rocks, lots and lots of big rocks. And you think, how can anything possibly grow here? Well, if you look down, there are these little tutu bushes, often very small. And they don't look significant in and of themselves, but they have this great power. Their roots, their teeny tiny little roots, are able to actually break down the rocks, and they become these nitrogen fixers. I have no clue what that means, but apparently that's really good to create soil. And so these little tiny bushes are what begin new life as a glacier recedes. And so we'd get to the edge of the glacier and we'd see this. The tutus would be the first thing we'd see. And then we'd walk down, a few hundred yards, and then we'd see bigger trees or bigger bushes. And then we'd walk further and we'd have our first trees that we would see. And then we'd walk further down the path, further away from the glacier. And sooner or later we would get to the first forest. And we would get to see how this life is teeming in this area, and it's all because all the way back there were these little tutu bushes that could create good soil. The last story I want to tell you is a story. The truth is, I am horrible at all things plant-related. Do not ask me to watch your plants. Steve and Connie Walsh, if you're listening to this, I promise your plant in my office is still alive, but I don't know why. I had them sign a waiver to give me permission to watch their plant because I don't trust myself. I'm not good with plants. My grandfather, on the other hand, was amazing with growing plants. He could grow just about anything. He had this little strawberry patch that I swear he planted just for me, He had a greenhouse. Every time he'd come down to Florida to visit his sister, he'd bring something back that should not grow in Pennsylvania, but he was able in his greenhouse to make it grow. And then he'd have this big plot of land in the backyard that would grow flowers. He would have raspberry bushes, and he had these trellises of tomatoes. And they were the best tomatoes. He and I would live on tomato sandwiches all summer long, did not want to eat anything else. One summer, my grandfather decided to try to grow Brussels sprouts. He gave my mom a bag of Brussels sprouts that he grew, and my mom fixed them. We all took one bite at the family dinner that night, and needless to say, I did not have Brussels sprouts again for 20 years. My grandfather could grow the best tomatoes, but could not grow a Brussels sprout. And it wasn't because my grandfather couldn't do it. It was because the soil content required for tomatoes is different than Brussels sprouts. And so no matter what he did, Brussels sprouts would not be his friend, and he did not grow them, thank God, after that first year. Soil matters. Good soil matters. When Jesus was sharing this parable of the 4 soils to the crowd understood soil in a way that I don't understand it this day. I don't try to grow things. Many of us don't try to grow things. Some of us are farmers. Some of us have our little gardens out back, but not all of us. But back in the day, when Jesus' crowd heard this, everybody grew. Whether it was a little plot for their vegetables or they were a full-on farmer, everybody knew good soil mattered. So when the first crowd heard this parable, to them they probably heard it a little bit different than we did. And what would have probably stood out for them in a way that does not stand out for us today is the recklessness of the sower. This sower sows seeds intentionally on paths, on rocky soil, amongst the weeds and the thorns. Why? Why would you do that? Any farmer would know that that is a waste of good seeds. But here we are, Jesus' parable, having the sower doing that. And I suggest what is being communicated to these first listeners of this parable is the story of God's grace. God does not discriminate. God does not deem who is fit or unfit, who is worthy or unworthy of receiving this good news. But God sees potential in all soil. God's grace is big enough for all. I think that might have been what the crowd heard that day. Our reading today of the gospel, what we don't see in ours is actually that it's 2 different readings. There's a whole section of verses that are missing. The first reading, the first time we hear about the 4 soils, that is Jesus speaking to the crowd at large. Then when Jesus gives the cliff notes and tells us what each soil means, that is actually happening later on and only to the disciples. In a sense, Jesus is, I think, trying to communicate something different to the crowd at large and to the disciples. So while to the crowd at large, Jesus is simply trying to make sure that the crowd knows that God is filled with grace and that all are welcome. But there's something different that Jesus is communicating to his disciples. And first, to understand this, I think it's helpful to understand the context. The chapter before this, we have a climax to the Pharisees' discontent with Jesus. For a while, we've been hearing grumblings from the Pharisees. They're not really liking what Jesus is getting up to. But right before our parable today, the Pharisees conspire to destroy Jesus. The word that is being sown among the Pharisees is not taking root. And Jesus knows this. And then right after today's reading, we have Jesus going back to his hometown, and most of his hometown rejects him. Again, seed not taking root. But here is Jesus throwing those seeds out anyway. So let us take a moment and think about what Jesus is maybe trying to say to the disciples specifically. And I think there's at least 3 things that Jesus is trying to teach the disciples through this parable. First, I think it's a bit of a warning to the disciples that while they have the seeds within them right now, and right now it appears that they are good soil, that as we all know, soil might be good one year and not so good the next. And so there is this call to continually ask and evaluate how our good soil is doing. And if the pH balance is off, if the nutrients that are vital for life don't appear to be there anymore, to take agency, to do what we can to improve the quality of that soil so that the word can continue to take hold. I think for us today, it means evaluating how our own spiritual journeys are doing individually. What are the things that are taking root, and what are the things that are choking out our relationship with God? What are the things getting in the way? What are the things distracting or sabotaging our relationship with God? I think continually asking that a question of ourselves and evaluating that. And those times, those seasons when we feel like our roots are not going deep, because we all have those seasons if we're honest with ourselves and one another. What are new practices or old practices that we can take up once again to help us get our roots deep, so that when storms come, so that when weeds grow up around us, we can say, girlfriend, go away. So that we know that we are with God and God is with us. And so that we can bear good fruit as we are called to do. To continually ask and evaluate how our soil is doing. Secondly, I think Jesus is offering some instructions for the disciples. Just as a fruit tree, as it grows up, the fruit tree was planted there intentionally, it grows up, it starts to bear fruit, which means in itself it begins to distribute fruit. So we ourselves become associate sowers. We're not the primary sower of the word, but we're associates. We get to be part of this process. And as we are sowers of the seeds, sowers of God's word, both in our words and in our actions of love, I think Jesus is reminding the disciples then and us today that we are not to discriminate, that we are not to determine who is fit and worthy of this good news, that we are to see the potential in all soil. And so that we are to sow those words, those deeds of love indiscriminately, just as Jesus does, just as God did as the sower in this parable. And lastly, I think this parable is meant to be words of encouragement for the disciples. As we hear this parable, we hear a sower who sows seeds willy-nilly and possibly carelessly, but we also hear of all these seeds that don't take root or don't last, that don't bear fruit. We hear that 3/4 of the soil is not good, and that can be discouraging for any of us if we're constantly trying our hardest to sow those seeds of love and just don't see the fruit happening. But there's encouragement in these words today. The seeds that fall on good soil, they bear fruit 160, 30 folds. That abundance is so great, it completely takes out the seeds that were wasted over here in the poor soil. And in the end, we have this flourishing place we have this great abundance of the fruits that we need for life. So don't be discouraged when we don't see growth, but know that the kingdom is alive and active and fruitful. So as we head out into our world this week, I think we are called to first remember God's reckless love, God's grace for all of us. We're called to remember that we have self-agency in our own soil, in our own spiritual journeys. And we are called to keep hope, to know that this excessive love of God's is growing and that fruit is already abundant. Amen.